I'm going way back before Zimbabwe. I'm going back to London, actually, was when I met David in 78, 79, sometime like that. And I met him. I'm not going to talk about in London about health because I don't know anything about the health side of David's activity. I met David through straight politics, the politics of an organization that we both joined called the International Marxist Group, which was the British section of an organization called the Fourth International, which was the Trotskyist International set up in 1938. The most famous member of the IMG was neither I nor David. It was Tariq Ali, who was the one you could probably have heard of. And I just want to look a little bit at the scenario of London British politics at that time. The IMG was probably at its peak 1,000 members, 1,000 cadres, I suppose you could call them. Not the biggest left organization in Britain. The biggest was the Socialist Workers' Party. Even they were probably 2,500, 3,000, but they were bigger. So it's interesting, why did I and why did David join the IMG? Why didn't we join the bigger organization? And I think there were a number of reasons for that. And probably the first most important one was the orientation of the organization towards the United Front and towards mass organizations. Because I think what distinguished that particular tendency of politics in Britain at that time was that we went into mass organizations and we built and respected the democracy of those organizations. We didn't try and take them over. We didn't try and set up our own mass organizations, because I think we understood that it's only through those self-motivating, self-organized organizations of the working class and the poor that socialism will come. It's not going to come from little political organizations running around doing their own thing. So I think the attitude towards the United Front, and I think that remained with David through his life, was really important. It was an interesting time in the UK at the time. There was a very powerful socialist feminist movement that had grown up during the 1970s. So classic Marxist organizations had to wrestle with feminism, with gender politics. What is the relationship between class politics and gender politics? Big debates, and a very interesting time to be around at that time. Another important aspect, I think, of the IMG at that time was it was part of an organization that believed in the internal democracy of political organizations, unlike many that all of us have known. And therefore, there was the right to, in the build-up to what were reasonably frequent congresses of the organization, the right to form tendencies, to form groupings around particular political positions, and then to fight for those positions in the organization. And I think that aspect of democracy, there's a thread of democracy that runs through David's politics and the politics of that grouping, I think, the thread of democracy, the democracy of the mass organizations and the democracy of the organization itself. And then we've heard already David's global footprint, let's put it like that, rather than more controversially. And it came from the fact came from his internationalism. And his internationalism was very deeply rooted. It's rooted again in that same political tendency which understands that there is no socialism in one country. We saw what happened to those who tried to build socialism in one country. It became a repressive state and ultimately collapsed. There is no future for socialism in one country. The only future is an internationalist future. And so David, when he was in the UK, he didn't just work, although he did work on Zimbabwean politics and Southern African politics, he also worked on British class politics, because class politics are actually international politics, and he was able to develop in that direction. I think then probably the most important element in that politics was what we call transitional demands. The idea that rather than this thinking that there are reforms that we struggle for today over here, and then there's the maximum program over here, and we'll get there. We'll get to the maximum program sometime or sometime never. And the idea of transitional demands, that one raises demands during the struggle that challenge and press against the limits of what capitalism can provide, so that we both relate, on the one hand, to the real needs of working and poor people, and at the same time we challenge capitalism. And that's a fundamental thought and a fundamentally important aspect. And I think it's something that we need to reflect on if we look at politics in South Africa today. Because in South Africa today, we see too many examples of those who come from the tradition of the Communist Party, who struggle along the lines of daily issues, often in quite a reformist way, and then jump on platforms and speak revolutionary slogans. And there is no link between those things. On the one hand, there's a reformist, you see it in the trade unions today. I won't mention the name of the trade union I work with, but you see it in all trade unions. The most revolutionary trade unions are actually thoroughly reformist in practice and have a reactionary trade union practice. And it's because of the failure to link those, the struggle for reforms. As David said, he did struggle for reforms. He believed in struggling for reforms, but he was no reformist. And that's the challenge, to find that route forward. He, I think, was inspired in his politics as he came into Marxist politics by famous and a notable revolutionary of the Fourth International, Ernest Mandel. Ernest Mandel was an underground freedom fighter during the war, and then a political economist and a theoretician. One of the things that people remember about Ernest Mandel was during '68 in Paris, when he'd been on a demonstration and he got back to his car, and there was his car in flames. And he said at that point, "Ah, comme c'est beau, c'est la révolution." It's beautiful, it's the revolution. David, while he was in London, worked on Southern African politics. There was a grouping in the Fourth International led by somebody who some of you know, Claude Gabriel. There was a grouping which worked on looking at issues and looking at strategies in relation to Southern African politics. He was also active in something called the Zimbabwe Information Group, which produced a monthly bulletin. It had a network inside Zimbabwe. It was critical of nationalism. It was not just subservient to nationalism. It's a difficult line to steer. To remain in some way related to nationalist struggle, whilst at the same time not being subservient to it. Emmanuel and I encountered exactly the same thing with the Namibia Support Committee, which we both worked in together in the late 70s and early 80s. And interestingly, when I was in London, I didn't really know what David did. He was quite secretive about it. In fact, I didn't know his name for a long period of time. For me, David's name was Simon, which was his name in the IMG. He was very nervous that if he was an open Trotskyist at that time, he would not be very well received by the incoming regime of the new Zimbabwe. And so we didn't know him as well as we might have. I next encountered him in '82 when I went to Harare to visit him and Sue. I'd been working in London. It was Thatcher. Life was grim. The Falklands Malvinas War was rousing the people, and those of us who opposed it were very small in number and rather embattled. So I escaped initially for a month to go to Zimbabwe. And there I heard of what he had initially seen when he went back in 1980. He traveled widely around the country at that time. And what he saw was, in some areas, the liberated areas, the parts of the country which had been liberated in the late 70s, he saw the beginnings of an organic democracy that had grown up in those liberated areas. And in fact, he saw in Bondolfi Mission, he saw the beginnings precisely of the community health worker system, which he did his best to build in Zimbabwe subsequently, grown through an organic process where community health workers were elected by their local community and were accountable to their local community. There it is again, democracy, the thread that runs through. The building of grassroots democracy is the sine qua non of revolutionary practice. And I went on a tour with him. He put me in his car and we traveled all around. We went to Chisumbanje in the Lowveld. We went to Matabeleland. We went everywhere. And I saw things that I had never seen before. And David, I think, then saw in Zimbabwe what happened, because that organic democracy was supplanted, was squashed, was replaced by a top-down, bureaucratic democracy that was imposed on everybody. And that was the beginning of that kind of a process. And so then I think the last thing I want to say is we've talked, I think, many of us, about the other aspect of David, and that's his humor. So I want to finish with a joke that David told me, if you will forgive me. I heard actually Oscar was supposed to be doing the humor, but I'll tread on your territory for a moment, if I may. It's the only joke. I remember very few jokes, and this is the only one of David's that I remember, and it's about 3 Jewish men sitting down, trying to impress one another about how holy they are and how devoted to God they are. And they sit there and the first one says, "You know, when I die, I'm going to take 10% of my wealth and I will give it to God. The rest I will give to my family." And the second one, he was not going to be outdone. The second one said, "Me, I am going to take 30% of my wealth. 30% I'm going to take and give to God, and the rest I will give to my family." And the last one scratched his head because he was a little bit nervous. Then he said, "You know what I'm going to do? I am going to take all my wealth, and I'm going to throw it up in the air. And what God wants, he will take, and the rest is for my family." Thank you.